Hey everybody, welcome back. So I had a couple people while I was in conversations with them over the last month or so. We were talking about just our ponderings about the role of genetics in benzo withdrawal in terms of why some people maybe have a more difficult time than others, why some people go into protracted, that sort of thing. And I think it's a good question, and I'm not a genetic therapist, I'm not a geneticist, I'm not an MD, so these are my armchair ponderings that I just am putting out here as discourse for us to talk about and think about, and kind of what I've been able to ascertain and understand so far just in my own looking and thinking about this. I think we have so far to go in the field of genetics, right? And we've come so far in the last 20 years. We've made enormous strides in being able to isolate certain genetics, certain genes and certain genetic codes that can cause things from everything from, Huntington's chorea and ALS to early onset familial Alzheimer's, those types of things. So there's so much happening in the field of genetics, and actually many of you might have heard, and if you haven't, it's something to think about. I don't know if insurance companies are covering this yet or not. It's relatively new, probably I think maybe in the last decade or so, where you can actually have genetic testing done. We all know kind of, 23andMe, the DNA testing, but you can also have specific tests done. So for example, before I knew about 23andMe, about 5 years ago or so, I did a series of genetic tests through Genemind, and it looked at just psychotropic medications, just psychiatric medications. And it showed, I think I mentioned this in another post, it showed that out of the benzo group, I would be a slow metabolizer of Valium. That could be a good thing, but it could also potentially be a bad thing. I've met other people that were considered slow metabolizers of Valium, and they felt the buildup of the Valium in their system. They weren't metabolizing it correctly, and so they would have this buildup and then the side effects of that. So I knew I made the choice to stay away from Valium when I was making my decision on how to taper off of my Xanax. But what also came up in the testing was, anything in the antipsychotic family class of drugs would not be good for me. So my point in bringing that up is that I think we're making strides, right, to understand how our genetics are interplaying with the medications that are available to us. And there's other tests that you can do that are more comprehensive than just the psychotropics and the psychiatric meds. So it's something to think about, something to talk with your medical team about if it's something you're interested in and gaining more information about. But in terms of how, what is the role of genetics in why some of us really get burned with serious withdrawal and protracted withdrawal and some of us don't, I don't know that we have the answer to that question. I would imagine there's an answer inherent in there somewhere that maybe one day we'll come across. I hope that's true. But what got me thinking and more curious was the idea and the role of epigenetics. And epigenetics are really the way that our behaviors or our environment interplay and affect how our genes are turned on or off. So you have this genetic makeup, you have these DNA sequences, but epigenetics is the way in which in our lives we affect how those genes are kind of dictated on and off, okay? And I won't go into like all the fancy words about this. You can I'll try to find some good relatable articles to put below if I can. But epigenetics change throughout our lives, okay? And so again, if you're thinking about how we're interplaying with our environment, and the way I think about that would also be things that we're taking, right? So for example, in my story, I had a neurotoxic reaction to the antibiotic Levaquin, and that began the cascade of symptoms that ultimately led me to get on a benzo. Interestingly, when I first came off the benzo after 10 months, I stopped taking it. I was taking between 5.5 and a milligram of Xanax, which is not a small amount, for 10 months or more, and I walked off. With no taper. I did not know to taper. Nobody told me to taper. I walked off this medication and I didn't have any withdrawal, which unfortunately led me when I had a surgery a couple years later and they gave me Versed in the surgery, I think that's what tipped the scales. And I woke up with all the same symptoms. I still didn't know anything about benzo withdrawal at this point, and that's what led me to returning to the Xanax. It worked before, it should work again. This time the medication didn't work. I got very sick on it, and then when I tried to come off, I became even more ill. And so now I'm, as you guys know from my story, I'm spending years, coming off a medication that I just took for a couple months in 2020 and immediately started to try to get off and couldn't. So when I think about epigenetics, I also think about a lot of things. So I think about, what was going on for me in terms of maybe how the effects from that fluoroquinolone antibiotic were affecting my genes being turned on and off and how I'm responding to things. I also think about stress and how we're responding to the stressors in our environment. And, a lot of times what we talk about in benzo withdrawal is this sensitized nervous system, right? And how many people aren't in benzo withdrawal but have sensitized nervous systems and have extreme anxiety and lots of symptoms of things of a sensitized nervous system, what they're not in benzo withdrawal. So I think about the effects of things like stress as an epigenetic factor. So again, other medications, stress in our lives, how we eat, how we exercise, how we sleep, all of these things are considered kind of epigenetic factors that play a role not in the changing of our DNA necessarily, but in how our genes are turned off and on. Okay, and so I think that is an interesting place for us to kind of pay attention to for a couple reasons. Because also, if you think about epigenetics, right, this is also occurring while we're in withdrawal, right? Most of us who are going through a complicated withdrawal are having changes to our diet, our exercise, our sleep patterns, right? How we're interfacing with stress, how we're in our relationships. So all of our behavioral and environmental factors are actually changing, a lot of times not for the better, right? We're oftentimes not able to exercise. Oftentimes we have to really limit what we eat. This can be a good thing. The dietary changes can certainly be a positive thing. I know for me, cutting out sugar and caffeine and things like that, when I'm healed, I don't plan on going back to those things. I don't plan on returning to eating a lot of sugar and caffeine. So the dietary changes I've made as a result of being in withdrawal can be positive. But sleep patterns get interrupted a lot of times in withdrawal. That can be a negative thing. How we're interfacing in our relationships and getting support and feeling effective in our relationships, that can be greatly impacted by being in withdrawal. So we also have the epigenetic factors that might have led to while we're experiencing a certain type of withdrawal experience. And then there's the epigenetic factors that are happening while we're in it. The best news of this, though, if I'm thinking about the idea of epigenetics, is that it's reversible. With our genetics, with our basic genetics and our DNA codes, we don't know enough, but what we tend to know is that these things are not necessarily reversible. Epigenetics are. And I was reading something about, for example, smokers versus non-smokers versus people that used to smoke. And they were looking at, I don't want to talk a ton about the fancy words, but they were talking about a particular gene. I think it was called the AHRR gene. And that people that smoke and that are heavy smokers and long-term smokers tend to have what's called less DNA methylation than people who don't smoke, okay? So again, fancy word, don't worry about it. The most important thing to remember is that the heavy smokers and the long-term smokers had changes at that particular gene in terms of it being turned on or off, okay? And basically, because with the smokers they had less DNA methylation, the genes were being turned off. Okay, but what was cool about it and why it's important for us is that as they were able to come off and stop smoking, that also began to change. Okay, they began to have increased DNA methylation. And again, this is all kind of fancy and a little bit above my head, and certainly not something I want to, promote as something I fully understand. But what I did understand this, and what I saw in that example, was that people that were smoking had a pretty dramatic change to that particular gene, the AHRR gene, and that was causing problems. And as they quit smoking and moved further away from that habit, the epigenetics shifted and changed and was able to actually affect that gene in a different way, in a much more healthy way. Okay. And now for each person, it kind of depended on, how long they'd been smoking, the extent of how long they'd been smoking. Sometimes those were factors. And then there's just unique kind of idiosyncratic factors of, we don't know why one person kind of bounces back after smoking 25 years and another person, continues with, all sorts of respiratory issues and other types of issues. Again, each person is so different. I think that's where we get so frustrated in this, right? Is we would love to locate a gene that tells us we are more likely to have a problem processing benzodiazepines or coming off them. But I don't know, number one, if that's ever going to happen. And I think epigenetics might be more of an answer for us. And I also like that because it's a little bit more reversible, and it gives us a little bit more hope that even if our behavior has turned a particular gene off, as we move away and as we heal, there may be a chance that we can that gene that's maybe creating this problem for us gets turned back on. Okay, again through this process of epigenetics and changing our behavior and changing our environments and doing things that are healthy for us. And that's why in some of my other videos I've said, I get that many of us in this can't exercise, or all different things are kind of getting in the way of us being able to take up our lives in a way that was really high functioning prior to this. But I think that when we are able and we get little glimpses of increased capacity, we want to kind of take advantage of those. Again, not, put the pedal to the metal and oh, I'm feeling better today, so I'm going to go run a marathon, or I'm going to go suddenly jog 5 miles, or I'm going to go eat a pizza now and I haven't eaten badly in a year. I'm not talking about kind of, impulsive, dramatic changes, but I'm saying that as we begin to see healing, I think we can build on that. And that goes back to some of my other videos that I've made on, again, taking those baby steps when you can, and not pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone to the point that we're further harming ourselves with our nervous system injuries, but that we are, maybe year one you can walk a mile, and maybe, you build up to 1.25 miles, then you build up to 1.5 miles. Everything for us in benzo withdrawal, from my opinion, needs to be a very slow and steady change, even if it's something positive, right? Whether it's adding in a supplement or adding in exercise or changing our diet, changing our relationships, changing our vocations, moving, all of these things that are normal stressors in healthy people that are not injured, have a much higher interplay with us. And again, these are kind of what I would consider epigenetic factors, right? That are going to, again, not change our DNA, but affect how our genes are turned off and on. And so with that, I take this as very good news that this goes back to my point of I do believe we heal. And I do believe, again, for some people, it's not, it's not months. For some people, they experience, years of needing to heal. And there may be various genetic and epigenetic reasons for that. But I found this to be good news. And so I wanted to just kind of talk about it and put it out there and, think about, again, the various ways that, what are the things we can control and that we can't control, okay? Epigenetics, given that it's our environment and our behaviors, and our kind of external factors, we have a little bit more control over that. Again, in benzo withdrawal, when we're in the height of it, it might feel like we don't, and I certainly get that, but paying attention to, what are some of these factors that might be contributing, And again, this is all guesswork, but it's a kind of a good launching place, and it's an interesting place for us to do some research. And I'm certainly going to do a little bit more investigating and thinking about how this might play into why some of us have a harder time than others. And again, using myself as an example, my genetics probably wouldn't have shown that I would have a problem with benzodiazepines, right? I took Xanax at a relatively, normal to high dose, 0.5 to a milligram a day, for 10 months, and I stopped taking it, and I had no withdrawal. It was only when I went back on it again, and we can understand that dynamic through kindling, kind of that sensitization of our system through coming off and on a medication. That's how we've come to understand it. But it's also made me question this idea of epigenetics, right? Because my life also changed as a result of having had that antibiotic injury. I suddenly had a different attitude towards the healthcare system, and probably an increased fear and anxiety around it. Prior to going into that surgery that led me into my second episode, I was in some pretty high stress for the 3 months going into that. So my epigenetic factors may have been at play in terms of why the second time I took the benzo, on top of kindling, those epigenetic factors might have also been at play as to why this time the way my body was able to manage the medication and was able to maybe metabolize it in a less healthy way, or less functional way. I don't know. Again, just things for us to consider and ponder, and hopefully over these next many years, we're going to get much more clear about the role that genetics does play in this experience for us, and maybe we'll find some answers. Thanks so much, guys. Take care.